Welcome back again to our online lectures of economics. This particular lecture is the introduction to really the heart of macroeconomics. Right? And we've been discussing GDP, gross domestic product. Right? So GDP is a measure of a nation's economic output. We measure it in dollar terms. In other words, we measure it in the monetary measure of all we call final goods and services are produced within the nation's borders, anywhere here in the United States, within a specific time period, right? So we said there's two ways to measure GDP. We can either add up all the money that was spent on final goods and services, the expenditures approach, or the income that was generated in producing those very same goods and services, the income approach. And the expenditures approach is the one by far that is more important. It's emphasized by economists, it's used by textbooks, and it definitely makes it easier to understand or break down GDP. So up to this point we had covered, we said GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X. C is personal consumption expenditures, as you can see up top there, durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. I is gross business investment, so when small, medium-sized, and large businesses, corporations buy machines and tools and factories and equipment or refurbish existing equipment, all of that is called investment spending, and of course those machines and equipment become known as capital. That's why sometimes you hear the term capital investment, right? And we just went over all that, and we went into detail about net domestic net investment for the year, about how much capital we started with for the year, how much depreciation took place, and how much new capital was purchased. And we talked about why that was an important statistic. So we covered C and we covered I, consumer expenditures and business investment. Now let's talk about G. And G is pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. All right. So when the government spends money on goods and services, expenditures on goods and services. So for instance, whether it's a state government, a local government, or federal government, say they need a computer to help organize and keep track of whatever it may be. It might be I don't know. We'll say it's the local state government which is trying to track pollution in a certain area, so they need that computer to the EPA, that government agency. All right, so that purchase of a final good, that's obviously counted as GDP. The next one, expenditures on social capital, so things that we need, right? It's sometimes called infrastructure, roads and schools and bridges, right? That type of spending is definitely counted towards GDP. All right, part of that would also be defense spending, right? So defense spending, and here's a good question for you, all right? Of total U.S. GDP, so we're in the year 2012 currently. It's currently May of 2012. So let's say last year's GDP was roughly $15 trillion. The United States produced $15 trillion worth of economic output in one year. All right, so what percentage of total economic output, what percentage of that $15 trillion worth of economic activity was military expenditures, right? So I'll let you think about that for a moment. And the correct answer is a whopping 4%. That's it. So 4%. And I think, when I do this in my actual classes, I have students guess and they write down their answers, and people guess outlandish things like 70% and 50% and 40%. But only 4% of total economic output is military output. So what's not included? Now we said this before when we introduced the definition of gross domestic product. Purely financial transactions, so government transfer payments not counted as GDP. We're not saying that they're not necessary. We're just saying they're not counted towards GDP. So unemployment checks, welfare checks, social security checks, these are purely financial transactions, okay? So no good was produced there, no service was provided. We would be overstating gross domestic product if we counted those towards economic output. Right? So that's what. Now, what about the last part of gross domestic? So the last piece of our puzzle here, right? We have GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X, and X stands for net export. So what we want to do is we want to add in all the goods and services produced here in the United States but sold to foreign countries. Those are exports. So for instance, let's say that GM produces an automobile here in Detroit and sells it to, I don't know, someone in Britain, right? So that's a U.S. export. Or if we produce Caterpillar produces one of those great big earth movers, and we put it on a ship and we send it down to, say, some South American country like Brazil, that's a U.S. export, right? And then imports, goods produced or services produced in some other country. Well, we import a lot of oil from OPEC countries, Middle Eastern countries. We import a lot of goods from China. We actually have a trade deficit. Is something we're going to talk about right now. So right now, the United States has a trade deficit. This was the 2011 trade deficit. So our exports are less than our imports, or a better way to say that is just simply that our imports are greater than our exports. So this is actually C plus I plus G minus X, right? Minus X. So to the tune of negative 588 billion. That was the U.S. trade deficit last year. So interestingly enough, though, we have a trade surplus in services. The United States actually exports more services than we import, so we have a trade surplus. And the trade surplus actually grew. I think it was roughly like 23% or something. So our trade surplus went up, right? But unfortunately, our trade deficit went up greater than our trade surplus went up. So we continue to have a trade deficit. Now, is the trade deficit an issue, an economic issue? That's one of those great normative debates. Obviously, in this particular course, in this particular lecture at least, we don't have time to spend 15, 20 minutes, even a half hour debating this. Very well-educated economists have this debate on TV all the time. If you're interested, there's been books written about the trade deficit. Some economists believe it's simply paramount to Pennsylvania producing more goods and selling them to Maryland than vice versa. And other economists think it's going to be the ultimate demise of the United States. So probably in between those two extremes lies the truth somewhere, right? Now, one important thing, though, how do we finance the trade deficit? In other words, if we import more than we export, how do we finance that trade deficit? Well, the United States is actually the world's largest debtor nation, debtor, D-E-B-T-O-R, debtor nation. All right, so we either borrow, which I just said we're the largest debtor nation, or we sell off real American assets to finance that trade deficit. Right, so we either borrow money from foreign countries or we sell off real American assets. All right, so here it is, putting it all together. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X. C plus I plus G plus X. And that's something you should be very familiar with. At this point, you should understand what we mean by C plus I plus G plus X, the expenditures approach to gross domestic product. All right, so on the left-hand side here, we have in billions of dollars personal consumption expenditures, and this is for 2009. This was the most recent data available for the McConnell textbook. All right, so 2009, we have personal consumption expenditures to the tune of just over $10 trillion. So you can see personal consumption expenditures, a large part of GDP. So most of our GDP is personal consumption expenditures on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. All right, gross business investment, right, was 1628 in billions of dollars. So 1,628,000,000. I'm sorry, $1,628,000,000,000. Right now, a good comparison would be to say, okay, how is gross business investment in 2009 compared to the previous period? In 2009, gross business investment was rather weak, and that should make sense because we're recovering from an economic recession. We're going to cover the business cycle quite soon here. So when we talk about the business cycle, one of the spending habits, or one of the spending forces, I should say, that drives the business cycle is gross business investment. So gross business investment at 1628 in billions of dollars for 2009 was actually less than what it was for 2008. And you ask, why maybe have companies not started hiring? Then, well, if you don't build new factories, or if you don't increase the number of machines and equipment in your manufacturing plant, you don't need people to run them. Right? Government purchases of 2 trillion, almost 3 trillion, 2,931,000,000,000. Right? Now, interesting. I just told you that on the previous slide. Net exports we had a trade deficit of $588 billion in 2011. Well, the trade deficit wasn't quite as bad in 2009, and that's intuitively that should make some sense. That when we're in a severe recession, and 2009 was probably the worst year of the recession. Right, we spend less money on goods and services at home, but we also import less. So the trade deficit narrowed. It was only 392 billion in 2009. Likewise, during an economic recession, since we produce less goods and services, we import less oil. And that tends to be a one-way street. In other words, we import lots of oil from OPEC countries. We tend not to export a whole bunch of goods and services to those same countries. So when the price of oil was down and we didn't import as much because we weren't producing as much, that probably helped the trade deficit there. All right. Now, the other side is the side you're not going to be responsible to know in detail. There are some important statistics we will derive from this side, but it's interesting to look and say, okay, where did the money end up going? What the income that was generated? Because remember, we said we can either add up all the expenditures, all the money spent on final goods and services, or we can add up the income generated from producing those very same goods and services. And you notice that compensation, which is basically wages, that was the highest component of the income approach. So wages is the highest component. That should make sense because there's roughly 150 million people on in the U.S. labor force, right? All right, and then we had rents, which rents it seems a little bit low, but that's probably because people can depreciate their properties. Interest, proprietors' income, sole proprietors that have both sort of a wage and sort of an interest portion to that. Corporate profits, right, which again compared to compensation to laborers seems rather low. Everyone's always griping that corporations make all the money. Well, according to this statistic, they don't really make all the money, do they? All right. And then you have all these statistical adjustments that we're not even going to bother talking about, but it was good to at least introduce, where did the income flow from the goods and services we produce. But what we will do on the next is first we'll compare U.S. economic output in trillions of dollars to other nations. And this numbers from 2009 is actually wrong now because in 2010 China surpassed Japan as the world's second economy. And you can see how neck and neck they were there in 2009. So by far the United States is the world's largest economic entity, right? Almost $14.5 trillion there in 2009 and closer to $15 trillion in 2011. Right, so we continue to grow our economic engines and continues to get larger. But Japan was the world's second largest economy for a very long time, and China just surpassed Japan. Right? Germany is a European country that is pretty efficient and rather gifted economically. But interestingly enough, if you took Germany, France, the UK, Italy, Spain, right, you added them all together. So we call that the EU, the European Union. The European Union as a collective economic entity would actually be on par with the United States. So if we said, what about the United States of Europe or the EU? How does their economic engine or how does their economic activity compare? What's GDP for the entire Eurozone? It's roughly the same. It's actually a teeny bit more than the United States. Okay, so the income approach. Some of these statistics are important here. We're going to talk about them, right, and talk about why they're important, right? The first one is net domestic product. And I'm not so concerned that you understand how we get this number, just what it is. And we'll look at the actual number on the next slide. But net domestic product is simply this, right? It's a measure of our ability to produce and consume without impairing our ability to produce in the future. So to get net domestic product, it's really not that difficult of a number to equate here. It's simply gross domestic product minus consumption of fixed capital or depreciation. So if we take GDP minus depreciation, right? So once again, it's the amount of money that we can produce and consume without impairing our ability to produce in the future. Right? National income is another interesting statistic. It's very closely related to the following idea. In other words, when you read through this in your textbook, it's a bit cumbersome, but you can think of national income in these terms, right? It's the income generated by American-owned resources, whether here in the United States or somewhere else. Right? So it's the income generated from American-owned resources put to work here in the United States or put to work somewhere else on the globe. So it's really a measure of how productive U.S. resources are around the entire globe. Right? Personal income is another important idea, right? Because you say, okay, well, how much money do we have to spend? It's very, very closely related to personal income. But remember, we have to pay taxes. So the final one is actually the most important one, disposable income. So to get from personal income to disposable income, right? This sounds a little bit weird, but we add in income that was received but not earned, and when we take out income that was earned but not received, at the end of the day, what we're really talking about here is simple, right? Disposable income is how much money we have left to spend, right, as households after taxes, and we actually throw back in there some transfer payments. Right? This next equation, DI equals C plus S, this is going to be the key equation that catapults our lecture for the next week when we start talking about some macroeconomic relationships and the Keynesian model. Right? John Maynard Keynes, famous economist. But for now, it's important to just identify what this means, right? Once we have money, it's okay, disposable income. That's how much money we have left to spend. That's income left after taxes. Well, we really only have two choices after we pay taxes. We can consume it. All right, we just went over that. Personal consumption expenditures on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services, or we can save it, right? So for an individual, if your after-tax income is say $50,000, right, and you save 5,000, well then you spend the other 45,000, right? If the nation takes in $11 trillion, and we'll see the exact numbers on the next slide, and spends 10 trillion, well, right, our consumption expenditure was 10 and our savings was 1 trillion, right? And that's an important idea to at least start thinking about for the next chapter. Well, here's the actual numbers, right? So for 2009, GDP was a little greater than $14 trillion, right? Net domestic product was simply GDP minus consumption of fixed capital, or GDP minus depreciation. So again, that's our ability to produce and consume without impairing our ability to produce in the future. Net domestic product came in at like 12.4, about 12 trillion 400 billion, right? National income, right? Again, American-owned resources put to work. National income, so 12, almost 12.3, right? 12 trillion 288 billion dollars. Personal income, so before taxes we had roughly $12 trillion worth of income, and then after we paid good old Uncle Sam our taxes, right, we had $10 trillion 924 billion dollars to spend. Well, that would be nice to just have a small chunk of that baby, right? So that's your disposable income. So we had from the 14 trillion 256 billion dollars worth of economic output that was generated, right? American households ultimately had $10 trillion 924 10 trillion 924 billion to spend on goods and services in the following year, or save, because remember, you could, with that disposable income, you can spend it or you can save it. Okay, now our simplified circular flow diagram of chapter 1/2 looked a lot easier than this one, but the great thing about this graph is that you can actually identify how much you've learned about macroeconomics in simply one lecture on GDP and measuring economic output by going through this circular flow, right? This macroeconomic circular flow. So first you want to do is identify the four orange squares, right? I think they're orange. I hope you think they're orange as well. So on the far right we have U.S. households. In the middle we have governments. To the left of that you have U.S. businesses. And all the way up top you have all other countries, right? So there you go. C plus I plus G plus X. Well, now in this order it goes, households on the right is C, U.S. government is obviously G, businesses is I, gross business investment, and it says their investment expenditures, and then net exports, right? X. So C plus I plus G plus X. So all those expenditures become, look at our rectangle there, gross domestic product. They all flow into that very large rectangle, gross domestic product, right? So that's the expenditures approach. Now, we're not going to go into the entire income approach. Like we said, is not quite as important, but it is important to identify, okay, from GDP to NDP, we simply said, all right, gross domestic product minus consumption of fixed capital gives us net domestic product. And flowing a little bit more to the right, national income, we already defined that. All right, and then what happens to the income, right? What happens to income? Well, we pay some taxes. You can see taxes flowing back to the government. All right, you can see actually some businesses receive subsidies. That's why some of it is flowing back to as subsidies, to businesses, right? And then finally, we pay tax. We end up with personal income. We pay personal taxes, and then that's left over for disposable income. So it gets you thinking about it. There's not many questions or on the quiz or anything about this, but it's a good graph because it gets you thinking about the entire flow of economic activity.